Thank you everyone for joining and tuning in for like today's webinar. I just wanted to, say thank you for all the panelists and obviously moderator Khadija. Thank you so much for doing this. This is kind of a series that we have kickstarted for our community members by community members. So it's quite unique. All these people are doing this pro bono, sharing their knowledge willingly, like so that it benefits everyone over here. With this, I would just like to like inform and tell everyone that we run Strategy Connect. It's one of the largest on-demand talent platform in the Middle East. We work extensively with public sector and private organization, and by virtue of which we have gathered and amassed specialized folks like all of you on the call and also on the panels over here today. I would not waste more time with this. I would hand it over to Khadija, who will be structuring the conversations today. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that intro, Hinder, and great initiative. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. We're going to dive straight into the discussion, and then we're going to do intros, change it up a little bit. So I'm going to ask all three of our panelists, Akshay, Pavan, and Pietro, to demystify net zero for us. Like, what really is it? And your name starts with A. You want to go first? We'll take in alphabetical order.
Sure. Thank you, Khadija. So I think everyone knows here about global warming, climate change. These are facts, and that they are caused by the greenhouse effect due to an excess of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Net zero is about reducing the human caused greenhouse gas emissions to zero, to a net of zero. And we say net because it's not possible in many cases to reduce them completely for some types of emissions. And therefore, then greenhouse gases need to be also pulled out of the atmosphere and captured and stored somewhere. But in the end, you need to reach a net of zero, what is called anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And this is the concept of net zero. Very quickly. I don't know if others would like to add.
Thank you. Yeah, I know. We've been using webcams for the past 3 years, but still someone has to speak with mute on, so it's going to be me on this call. So people always ask, what is net zero and how can companies set their net zero strategies? What are the steps that you need to go for setting a net zero for a company? Because I represent a company industry sector, so let me just walk you through what we went through and what I see industries go through. I think it starts with companies understanding what is their impact for the climate change and what is an impact towards climate effects. And understanding where their emissions are, what their scope 1 emissions are, what their scope 2 emissions are, and what their scope 3 emissions are as well, right? So understanding which one is the biggest one. For oil and gas industry, scope 3 is the biggest one. But for an industrial company like ours, which I represent cement industry, for us the scope 1 is the biggest of the impacts. So you start with that understanding and then develop your targets and strategies to address to meet the net zero. Of course, once you start setting a net zero strategy for yourself, for your company, you also need to understand what is the boundary going to be. Is the boundary going to be only on scope 1? Or your target's going to be on scope 2 and scope 3? And even their scope 1 and scope 2 in net zero, is it going to be on CO2 only, or is the target going to be on CO2 and all other greenhouse gas emissions? And is it carbon neutrality or climate neutrality? Because those are the entirely different things. I think those things you need to start on, but without delving too much into the next stages of setting a net zero for the company, let me hand over to Petro, but I'll come back to this topic on what are the next steps companies can take in developing the strategy.
Thank you. Pietro, are you ready?
Yeah. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me invited on this panel. I will focus on the founding element of net zero strategy, which is we must company, but also we as individuals must look at net zero as an opportunity as well as a threat. I've seen many supply chains and organizations are totally disrupted by environmental change nowadays. So with entire markets of supply being totally changed drastically from what is happening in the environment. But meanwhile, companies are like in some way are deriving some values from this change, which is not like becoming negative or offsetting the emission, but it's like changing the way they do business. So it's not like trying to diminish the emission on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, but in some cases, what is necessary is to revolutionize the purchasing behavior of companies' customers, to act a change from also an organizational and social point of view. And this leads to the born of new business model, new supply chains, and in general, new perspective for business development that take sustainability, net zero, as a primary competitive factors and use it to override their competitors in the actual markets and the actual scenarios that we are looking in those days.
Thank you, Pietro. And Pavan and Pietro, we'll come back to you for what is scope 1, 2, 3. We'll come back to that. But first, intros. So Pietro, everyone, he is based out of Italy, as you may have guessed. And he's in industrial engineering from, I don't know if I'm saying this right, Politecnico di Milano. I did a month of study travel in Rome. Was that okay? Was it worth it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, okay. Right pronunciation.
Thank you. And he has worked for several years with major consulting companies like BCG, BSG is my firm. And he has innovating coaching strategies, especially with startups. So that's Pietro. Pavan is global head and VP of the Carbon Capture and Utilization Services Department. Is the acronym correct?
Pavan? Carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
Storage, all right. At Holcim. And he splits his time between Switzerland and the UAE. And he, because he's in that sector, he works with moving the building sector towards a net zero transition. And Akshay is right now the strategy, I hate having to read, but I want to get the titles right. Strategy and PMO Manager at the Energy Efficiency and Renewables Office of RAK, Ras Al Khaimah, UAE. And he manages the energy sustainability agenda there. And he's also on the board of Advancing Net Zero Volunteering team. So that's our 3 fabulous panelists for you. They have a ton of on-the-ground industry experience. So line up your questions so that when you go to your clients in the future, you can say, oh, yeah, I heard this from Akshay or Pavan or Pietro, and this is what it takes. It's really not this nebulous space. It's very tangible. We can do it. All right, so shall we move on to our next area of discussion? So Akshay, you're with the public sector. Could you tell us a little bit about how countries would go about defining a net zero target? If you could give an example from the government, that would be great.
Sure, Khadija. So for countries, I would say their targets are a little bit already set. And I'll tell you why. So in 2015, or in some cases 2016, the Paris Agreement was signed by most countries in the world. This agreement is really a landmark agreement where countries agreed, no, the whole world agreed that we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial temperatures. A scientific body was formed, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, associated with the UN. This panel found out through a lot of climate modeling, a lot of research, that to do that, so to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, your best bet is for everyone in the world, all the countries, all the people, all the companies need to be net zero by 2050. Okay, that's the best chance we have to limit global warming. Now, developed countries target usually 2050 or something around this, based on the scientific recommendation, and that's how their targets are set. Developing countries, in some cases, have some leeway to have more looser targets or less ambitious targets. India, for example, targets net zero by 2070. Saudi Arabia by 2060. China also by 2060. These targets are also conditional to receiving some support from other countries, financing support, technical support from more developed countries. This is how targets are set at a very high level, at a country level. It's important to also note these targets are right now very political. They're political commitments because many countries, when they set these targets, they don't know exactly how they are going to reach. They don't have a very fixed roadmap for how they will completely decarbonize their whole economy. But they recognize that it is needed, and they recognize that there are some solutions. There are, I would say, solutions for most of the decarbonization problems that we have, and it's a question of finding the right way to finance them, to get them out there. It's usually environmental agencies in countries or environmental ministries that are setting these targets. So for the UAE is the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, together with the Ministry of Energy, that worked with the Prime Minister's office that to set the UAE's net zero by 2050 target. This was then further sort of fleshed out into a roadmap of a few ideas, built very collaboratively among all the government agencies. Local government was also involved heavily. My office was consulted on some matters. And then local governments also have a lot of leeway deciding how to get to net zero in the UAE's case for each emirate. So there are competitive advantages that some emirates have doing some things. But this is how the strategies are set.
That's quite insightful. Thank you. Bhavan, are you going to tell us how companies can go about setting net zero targets?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Akshay, for setting it up so clearly, right? So it starts for companies, it starts with understanding their own emissions as well, right? If it's a global company, which jurisdictions the emissions are in, and what are the country jurisdictional net zero targets? So if majority of my emissions are in India, I cannot really set my company targets 2050 because I'll have a mismatch between country and my own ambitions, or other way around. So I think understanding where your own emissions are extremely critical and baselining those to certain year so that you can measure progress is also important. We previously talked about scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3. You need to have an understanding about where your major emissions are. And with that in mind, then you can start setting about what is your scope of your ambition is going to be. So is it going to be your ambition is only on scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3? So once you said that, the next thing which one company can do is understand what are the climate related risks and the climate related opportunities. What are the physical risks for you as a company from a climate change? What are the liabilities that do you have, and what are the compliance risks that you have if you don't perform as per the compliance markets like ETS? When it comes to, let me give a specific example about the physical risks, right? If you are a chemicals company in the middle of Germany, and then if you rely on the Rhine River to export your chemicals, and bulk of that goes to the Rhine River. And imagine what happens last year when the waterfall was so low, and then at some levels, the ships that take your products out into the global markets could not use the Rhine River. So that's a huge physical risk that a company has, and you need to understand those risks, and also starts with opportunities. So the climate action also has opportunities, right? You have access to the new markets. You have access, the opportunity to increase your margin most of the time. You have access, you have opportunity to a qualified access to talent, as well as a reduced cost of capital. And all those opportunities needs to be taken into consideration. Once you have understanding of risks and opportunities, then the next thing one does is scenario planning. You need to develop very distinct and vivid scenarios of how the future might look like, and then stress test your current strategy to see whether my strategy at this moment which I have, how does the future scenarios impact me? Am I still resilient? Is my strategy still robust? So if you will not make your profits if any of the future scenarios materialize, then you have a problem of your strategy, right? So once you have those understanding of how resilient is your strategy, then the next thing is developing the net zero pathways. If your target is scope 1, then understanding what are your pathways available to you, what are the multiple options available to you to reach your net zero target, and develop a deep marginal abatement cost curve. What that means is, what is the cost if I use one pathway to meet the net zero on scope 1? How much it's going to cost, and what is an impact? And you create a marginal cost curve to understand which are the lowest cost opportunities for you to meet your targets, and what is an impact of that one. So, and then you need to assess, like, if in order to meet your net zero, you have multiple billions of revenue cost that is incurred, you also need to understand, do I have a company has a capabilities, financial capabilities to undergo this transition, and what is the limitations on that one, and how do I go forward? Based on all of this, you set science-based targets and validate by international organizations, so that what you're promising is credible, as well as the market believes in what you're saying. And once you set the targets, you need to, of course, align your financial planning and capital allocation that is aligned with this business ambitions, and then set your senior management remuneration and bonuses tied to this progress, making a progress on this net zero pathways. So that is how the steps I see that industries are going through in order to develop a robust and resilient net zero strategy and pathways.
Thank you. So Pietro, I know you're into modeling and you're big on the data and the technology and the innovation for net zero. We have a really engaged audience. Thank you for your questions, audience. So Nishant has asked us if you, and I think Pietro, you may be a good person to address this, is how is the data defined directly and indirectly for impact points? And how is the baseline created? Is that something you're comfortable taking, Pietro?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, as you were mentioning, I deal with quantitative models which are developed on a tailor-made approach for each company I work with. So it's not a generic approach, but it needs to be managed according to the specific characteristics of each business, and in which for sure the data play a crucial role. So we need to be aware that when talking about net zero, climate change, emissions, we are making estimation, because the sources of possible emission are too wide. Okay, the computation made with chemistry and physics, let's say paradigms, are quite difficult to be performed. So in most of the cases, the sourcing of primary reliable data could be a problem when addressing this kind of projects. Okay, so most of the times, some companies decide to to go for a life cycle assessment analysis, which is a structured scientific approach that computes all the direct and indirect emission related to the production, use, and disposal of a generic product, whatever it is. Okay, and this, of course, could last a lot of time and take a lot of effort because this kind of analysis it's made by scientists. Okay, so another possible alternative is to rely on certified data, okay, coming from those kind of analysis, but which are more generalized, okay, and in this respect, we can cite the IPCC database or other intergovernmental agencies that provides reliable data, okay. So once you have identified the primary basic data, you can like arrange them to put it in a model, but in a model which is capable of replicating your actual performances. So the model will need to replicate the financial performance as well as the service level performance, as well as the quality and flexibility performance. And so when it's validated under all those performances, it could also be useful to consider the environmental performance, which is something new for companies, okay, which is something which is at no reference in history, okay. So once the model could be considered as validated, and then it could be used, as Pavan was saying, to generate scenarios, okay, to generate alternatives which may trace what could be the impacts of sustainability decision across company value chain, okay, and provides an holistic approach, an holistic viewpoint on all the changes in the performances, such to build a real sustainable growth for the company, where sustainable means beneficial for the environment, but of course beneficial also for company financial statement, okay. So we need to change the mentality for which for companies sustainability is a cost. It is not a cost, okay? It's an investment. If you manage properly investments, you can gain a lot of efficiencies on the cost side, on the revenue side, on the service level side, okay? So it's just to find out the best strategy and to harmonize it along company competitive strategy. Okay, it's to mix the two strategies together.
Thanks. That's so interesting. So we have a great engaged audience. Pavan, you have a compliment in the chat, and Johnny complimented you, and he also said, in addition to the fact that your analogy was great, it made it all come to life and made it clear, crystal clear, Johnny says. And his question to you was, he's keen to understand how the energy transitions in such a hard to abate sector like cement are financed internally. And that's one of the curiosities we also had earlier is how can we level this playing field? Do you want to take that? You're muted again.
Seriously? So let's just bring why cement is a hard to abate sector and why action in the building sector is absolutely key, right? Let's look at the building sector. Building sector corresponds to approximately 35% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Out of that, 2/3 are in the buildings in use and 1/3 in the construction raw material goes in. And the amount of cement and concrete you use, as an anecdote, concrete is the most widely used man-made material. The world consumes, after water, the most consumed material is concrete. And in order to produce concrete, and you need to produce cement, and then cement is one of the lowest, highest emissions per the revenue of the product. So that makes it even more challenging. And the world, as we know, we are building one New York City, new buildings equal to one New York City every month. So with urbanization, with the population increase, there's going to be increase in the consumption of cement and concrete, but at the same time, in order to produce cement, you have to take limestone and burn it up to 1400 degrees. And if you take limestone and then burn to 1400 degrees, limestone contains CaCO3. The raw material itself contains carbon dioxide. If you want to produce cement, you have to use limestone. If you use limestone, you produce CO2. So on one side, you have the demand for the product is growing up. On the other side, and if you produce, you'll produce more CO2. So that is the reason why it's a hard to abate sector. And I think Andre, rightfully you said, right, there should be a cost to emit, and industry and society should internalize a cost of operations, and that is exactly what is available in Europe, right? Europe ETS, what it does is it puts a cost on the CO2 emissions, and any company who can find a ways and who become the first mover in decarbonizing, they would avoid paying that ETS. And as it happens, the cement sector, while it is difficult to decarbonize, we do have opportunities to decarbonize as well. So let's take my scope 1 emissions. My scope 1 emissions are from the raw material, which is the limestone use, and from the use of energy, which is 1400 degrees. Let's take one by one. My raw materials. I understand, I've previously mentioned that I need to use limestone. However, there's other also raw materials. There's a lot of construction happening, the old buildings demolished, and cement, as it happens, you can recycle infinite number of times. So can we use the demolished raw material and recycle it and repurpose and build with the recycled cement and concrete? That is exactly what Holcim is doing, and taking the leadership on the raw material side. And let's go to the energy. We have to heat the limestone to 1400 degrees. We can either use natural gas or coal, or we can use alternative sources of fuel. As it happens, most of the cities that we operate, they have landfilling, and landfilling causes methane emissions. Instead of landfilling, because we need 1400 degrees, we can direct what is non-recyclable from the landfillings and use that as a heat source to produce cement. And in some of our plants in Europe, 90% of our heat comes from alternative fuels, which is mostly municipal solid waste and waste tires and waste rubbers. Thereby, you not only create a positive impact to the society, but we get paid to process that waste heat. So instead of paying for the natural gas or paying for the coal, we get paid to use some waste as a fuel. So it creates a business opportunity for us. And the third one, scope 1 reduction, is we are championing carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So at this moment, because of the price on carbon, for me, deploying carbon capture, utilization, and storage will be cheaper than keep on emitting the CO2. And that is exactly what we are doing as well. We're creating more margins and more efficiencies by decarbonizing and creating a competitive advantage.
Thank you. Akshay, we have a question from Haninder. You could take that. He is wondering how government agencies and private orgs partner to start and the journey towards net zero.
Sorry, Khadija, could you repeat the question?
Sure, absolutely. Government agencies and private organizations partner with each other. If you could give us an example of how they partner to start and support each other towards net zero. Private and public partnerships.
Okay. Sure. So there are, I think, there are a lot of examples of PPP type projects that are very successful. I think PPP mode of partnership is a very, very, let's say, tried and tested way to take these kind of technical projects forward. For example, now what Pawan has been saying about using alternative fuels to power or to produce heat for cement. There is a very good example of a PPP project in a neighboring emirate, Al Quwain, not far from where I'm sitting, that produces RDF, which means refuse-derived fuel, from waste that would have gone to landfill, and then supplies that RDF to cement plants, actually, in Ras Al Khaimah and in Fujairah. Ras Al Khaimah is actually a center for cement production in the UAE. And I'm actually just wanted to add, the company that Pawan is working for, Holcim, is one of the companies that uses, I think, one of the most amounts of alternative fuel in the UAE.
Wow. So that's great. Pawan, I wanted to come back to you. If you could share a little bit on how when you use the energy from municipal waste, can you give us some ROI, some data around the impact that had? Or if that's tricky, you don't have to.
No, I will not go into the exact numbers, right? But I think it is a collaboration that you have with the cities, and it is the agreement that you can make, the pact that you can make that with the cities to make cities more livable, right? So there are significant challenges and impacts of landfilling municipal waste. It not only the health hazards, but also methane emissions from the landfilling are significant contribution to the greenhouse gases or to the climate change. And by avoiding methane emissions, you're actually helping the city, right? So what we do is we take the municipal solid waste and we rely on the recyclers to recycle as much as possible that can be recyclable, and what cannot be recycled, we use that in our cement facilities to avoid using natural fossil fuels. So, but of course, the ROI, I cannot go into details here.
That's
fine.
But
of course, we rely on the public sector, partnership with the public sectors in sorting the municipal solid waste, and then we offtake whatever cannot be recycled.
Thank you. And if you're able to share how that's helped you on the net zero journey, is there some data around that? The ability to tap into municipal waste energy.
So, for example, our major scope 2 emissions comes from the fossil fuel use. So, because as I've said, we need to heat up the raw material to 1400 degrees, right?
Yeah.
So often, some countries, if you use waste, it's not considered net emissions because you are avoiding emissions. That is one. And then two is often it happens in the municipal solid waste, there's biogenic material.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So we are avoiding, we're using biogenic material to fuel our kilns, and that reduces our scope 2 emissions. And if, for example, if I do capture that CO2 and stored it, I'm actually helping carbon removals. That is also a business opportunity for cement companies, right? Because if there's an opportunity to capture the biogenic CO2, you can repurpose that into sustainable aviation fuel, similar to what we are doing in our projects in Europe, or we can capture that biogenic CO2 and then store it, and it's a carbon removal credits that you can monetize.
That's a beautiful example. I'm so interested. I forgot to introduce myself. I recently did a project with Ashghal, the Qatar Public Works Authority. And this is such a great win-win example from so many aspects for so many parties and layers of the kind of change we want to see towards sustainability. So thanks, Pawan. Pietro, we have a question that I think your interest in global supply chains may speak very well to. So Andre has asked us, how do the causes compensate those impacted by climate change? So that's kind of our global upstream, downstream impacts of net zero. And net zero is a local concept. Single facility industry is what Andre is wondering. So could you talk to us a little bit, hopefully addressing Andre's question about how there's disparity between where the emissions are created and where they're impacted? Tell us about that.
Yeah, when analyzing a global value chain, one has to adopt a big picture approach, which is the main ideas I continuously repeat to companies and to entrepreneurs to whom I work with. Because most of the times companies look just at their courtyard of their plant, okay? So but it's not like a negative attitude. It's like not adopting a more big picture approach. So when they act to diminish their emissions, they sometimes take actions that could be beneficial for themselves, okay? But in the overall environment, they could damage the overall performance on the environment, okay? And this is the point with net zero. So net zero should not be evaluated for single company, okay? When evaluating decision about sustainability, one has also to consider the entire impact on the value chain, so also on the final users of the value chain. The traditional economic theory taught us that companies need to create value for their shareholders, okay? Entailing that shareholders are individuals or other organizations. While nowadays we need to enlarge this vision of a shareholder by including the whole biosphere. Okay, so when a company wants to produce value, it has to account also for the environment it works with. Okay, and this means that if I have a supplier that are geographically dispersed all over the world, I have to account for the single impact for what concerns my own purchasing behavior. Okay, and this will help in the close future to establish more reliable supply chains and also more supply chain more focused on the attention given to the single geographic areas in which their suppliers are based, basically.
If I can just add to this, I think
Please.
Governments also have a big role in making sure that corporates remain responsible also for the communities that they operate in through ESG reporting requirements. So mandates for ESG reporting by either stock exchanges or directly by securities authorities are very useful here. Secondly, mandates to spend CSR funds may also help here to make sure that these funds reach the right people who are today negatively affected by these externalities.
Yeah, I agree with your role. Pavan, did you want to take the question on carbon storage?
Yes, of course. I think that's often the question people ask about CCS, right? There's a criticism about CCS, but we also need to understand CCS is not a panacea, right? It's not applicable for all industries and all sectors, but there are sectors such as the cement sector. We cannot achieve net zero without CCUS. So because if you want to produce cement, you have to use limestone. If you use limestone, if you heat it up, you produce CO2. So, and bulk of our emissions is from the CO2, CO2 from the limestone. So for us, CCUS is an absolute must in order to meet the net zero. It may not be the case for all industries as well, right? So one is to go through their net zero pathway to understand which of the pathway, which of the what do you call technology you need in order to meet the net zero, what makes best for you. And I agree with you that CCS should not be applied to all industries, but for the cement sector, it is an absolute must. But I wasn't completely sure whether the question was related to CCUS or just the storage part.
We will wait for the person
Andre,
to
your question. I think it's Andre. So did you mean to say storage alone, Andre, or was it CCS in general?
I think he meant carbon storage in general. And
Yes,
until
sure.
Andre
Of course.
replies, go ahead.
Of course, it is. Andre has confirmed it is storage as well, right? So I think one needs to move away from either black or white kind of solutions. It needs to be a spectrum as well, right? For example, if I am in order to produce, in order to use captured CO2 for producing plastics or chemicals, or using for producing marine fuels, you need to have industry next to the cement plant to convert the captured CO2, convert into aviation fuel or marine fuel or plastics or chemicals. And if you have a cement facility in the middle of nowhere, you cannot really use that to ship across the geographic to convert that into any of the CCU opportunities. So from that perspective, the cement plants around the world, they need to look at what is around their ecosystem, whether CCS makes sense because the storage is available to them, or CCU makes sense because there's infrastructure that can enable conversion of the CO2 into any of the utilization products.
Great, thank you. Pietro has kindly offered to take on the next question. And panelists, I have to thank you for just being dynamic and spontaneous and addressing the questions as they come up. Thank you for that. Pietro, tell us, there's so much terminology going around. What is the difference? What is a subset of what?
Okay, I will try to demystify some aspects on circularity. Okay, circularity is one of the most impacting solution or alternatives in order to deal with sustainability and net zero transition. And that's mainly because what is a waste for an industry may become a primary raw material for another one. Okay, and this allows collaboration that are unique, and especially that put together supply chains and industries which in the traditional way of doing business are totally not connected. Okay, I've seen so many platforms and platforms of sites and startups that offer this service of matching the right circular loop for using the waste for a certain industries by providing them a possible different use among other industries, other customers. Okay, and the contamination between supply chains is quite infinite under this point of view. Okay, it is not just recycling the waste, okay, but it's using the waste as source of primary raw material. Okay, so I will just make a short example. In Italy, we have a lot of olive oil production, okay, for food industry, and this production entails the generation of waste under the form of dust, okay, which is a form of like a fossil dust used to refine the oil, and this dust is considered as an hazardous waste, okay, because it need to be stored and disposed in a certain way. And there is this manufacturer that partnership with a brick company producer, and so they use this waste dust as a primary material in spite of clay in the brick production, and this for sure contribute in reducing the emissions for both the industries. Okay, so because the waste is no more waste, but is a primary material for others. And those kind of business models are emerging, and apart from the reduction in the emission, constitutes new revenues streams for the companies. Okay, so there is a financial benefit for both the collaborating enterprises inside these circular loops. Okay, for sure, it needs to be weighted on also on the proximity of industry sectors. Okay, so I cannot be circular if my production is in Italy and I have to deliver the waste in the other part of the world, because it has an environmental cost and a financial cost associated to the transportation. Okay, so most of the times circularity loops are valid unless they realize in the same geographical area. Okay, for sure it depends on the business, but this contributes a lot in offsetting the emission. Okay, and in reducing in general the consumption of virgin raw materials, which is another aspect that companies have to account for. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Pavan. Akshay, did you want to add to that? If not, we have a great question. It's like this our audience was like part of our rehearsal because they have all the questions we had from before. So they have we have what Pietro you had said is a current hot topic, which is what are each of your three views as the panelists on the role that carbon offsets play in moving towards net zero? That can get pretty controversial.
Yeah. If you want, I can start just on what I was saying previously. Carbon offsetting is something company started to do for greenwashing purpose. Okay, so back in the story, carbon offsetting, so like activities like planting new forests and things like that, was a basic marketing activity, okay, just to declare the production or the logistic was environmental neutral, okay. But it is something that does not address directly the problem of net zero transition, okay. Also because we as humanity, we are taking land from nature, so we cannot continue to put forest because there is not enough space, okay? And of sure, the forest will not save us unless we do not change the way we consume, the way we produce, okay? So just to give a hard example of how carbon offsetting could be fight with legislation and regulation. And in Europe, there is a new regulation which will be used by major companies starting from 2025, which excludes the possibility for companies to account carbon offsetting for computing their carbon footprint. So companies could continue to offset emission just on a voluntary basis as a voluntary activities, but it will not account in their emission as a reduction. So they will be forced some way to implement practical plans to reduce the emission and not just to offset them.
I have a bit of a contrarian view on this one, right? So again, I'm going back to black and white question, right? There's no black and white in carbon offset. It's a gray area. Let's take it. Let me explain what I mean by that, right? Carbon offsets per se is not a bad thing. If the carbon offsets is used for greenwashing and the offsets are low quality, non-trackable, and there's no transparency, yes, absolutely, carbon offsets cannot be done. But there are some companies, if you are a big company where your bulk of the emissions are in the scope 3, the only way meaningfully you can do is the carbon offsets, right? But if you have a scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, if you're going to carbon offsets, that is not a meaningful thing to do. So it depends on the company to company. If you have your major emissions as scope 1 and scope 2, the right thing to do and the ethical thing to do is working on your reduction of scope 1 and scope 2 in your own operations, and then address your scope 3 emissions through supply chain considerations, only then consider carbon offsets. But if you are considering carbon offsets, ensure that those are high quality, trackable, there's a transparency in that carbon offsets. As a company, Holcim, we don't do much carbon offsets. I think our net zero pathway is based on reducing our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and 3 emissions, but there are some companies who may be forced to use carbon offsets. If we are using it, ensure that these are either technical offsets, technological offsets, and high quality offsets.
Okay, I think very good responses from Pietro and Pawan covering the points for companies, for organizations. For countries, my perspective is very different. Firstly, countries are not allowed to offset their emissions with other countries. So there are no offsets. And therefore, countries are not very keen on allowing companies also to offset their emissions outside the country, because it doesn't help countries to offset their own emissions. Having said that, it doesn't mean that there is no place for offsets at all. I think offsets are quite a useful economic tool on the path to net zero. I think offsets have an important place, especially for hard to abate sectors like in cement. There may be places where it is hard to directly capture, for example, and use emissions from cement, and therefore those emissions may be offset somewhere else. And I agree with Pawan there that such offsets, if you need to do them, should be of a very high quality, should ideally be offsets against real sequestration and not just offset created through a solar plant. So the issue today is that there are a lot of voluntary offset markets, not regulated at all, let's say, and which are just doing a lot of greenwashing, like Pietro said.
I think I'm not 100% sure, but then let me just instead say this. I think the true cost of carbon emissions to the society is around $90 to $100, if I recall correctly. And if because of your operations, the cost to the world is 90 euros, you cannot really buy a carbon offset for 3 euros and say that you have offsetted your emissions, right? That's not an ethical thing to do, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, maybe we can have a separate panel on carbon trading and offsetting. That's a whole nother book that each of you could write.
I think there are many topics here that deserve a lot of discussion.
Yeah. So you have been a fabulous panel. Go ahead.
Sorry, Khadija, I have another meeting now at 4. Yeah. So I think I'll have to leave. I think there are a couple more questions maybe that I hope you can take with the rest of them.
We have addressed all the questions. I'm really glad that we didn't wait till the end for the questions. We addressed them throughout. So I just want to say thank you to each one of you. Thank you. You've been present. You've given great examples, data, whatever you could share in this seemingly nebulous space. You've made it a little clearer for us today. Thank you, everyone.